one of the first questions I often ask is, who do you want to be lying awake worrying? When a hard question comes up, and inevitably you have to make hard choices that are going to hurt somebody or hurt some interest. How do you want your priorities to be aligned? And I think any community can ask, right? And how can you, at the beginning or at a crucial, early stage, make sure to set even just some basic frameworks to hold everybody accountable in a community? It's just an attempt to create a tool that enables people to more easily just throw together some quick bylaws on the assumption that you'll throw them out later.
Nathan, welcome to Accidental Gods. How are you and where are you and what time is it in your part of the world? Because you've just taken your kids to school, so it's a lot earlier than it is over here.
Well, I'm doing okay. It was a complex drop off, and but I'm very glad to be in this conversation. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, where I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder. It's mid-morning, and I'm really grateful to start my day with this conversation.
Thank you. It's a beautiful looking room, I have to say. And you're in the middle of summer, but it's not 40 degrees out there or anything horrendous yet, is it? I'm guessing, no?
No, we have the cool from the mountains still. It'll heat up by midday,
Okay.
Cool off by the evening.
Brilliant. Yeah. I was noticing things on social media, we'll get to the proper stuff in a minute, last night, where people were saying, we're all being asked to switch off our air conditioning and only use it when it's absolutely necessary. And the AI is sucking in enough power for, pretty much the whole of Scandinavia to draw pictures of cats with big eyes that we didn't really need. Maybe we could address that one as well. Maybe we could address that one, but not yet. Because you've written a book called Governable Spaces, which speaks absolutely to where we are in this podcast in terms of exploring the nature of democracy and the way that it spans online and offline, the way that our Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions are not fit for the godlike technologies that we have created. And how could we upgrade the first two, given that otherwise the last one might end up taking us back to the Stone Age? So, as a starter, because I found everything that you wrote in your book had depth and breadth and was genuinely exciting and meshes very well with the other things that we're exploring. From your perspective, in an ideal world, what is democracy? What is it for? What does it do? Take that where you want.
I think it's a tricky word, and I use it really cautiously because I think it's very easy for us to turn it into an idol. So many things get turned into idols, the gods that we make with our hands, and democracy can be one of those too. I do stick with the word, I stick with its trouble, but I do so advisedly. I mean, I think what I'm getting at with that word is a kind of society in which people can feel their own power and know their own power and have and mature into the possibilities that that we have together and in ourselves, and that those possibilities change with time. Those need to evolve. Our earliest democratic thinkers recognized that democracy could not stay still. It could not be just a set of fixed institutions. It would have to evolve, because the whole power of what we might call democracy is the ability to have an adaptive society, a society that can really respond and listen and hear people for who they are and for what they experience in a way that, no autocrat is ever going to be able to understand or know, that no oligarchy is ever going to be able to perceive and discern. The point here is to have that profound complexity enmeshed in our social systems, and also systems that deeply respect us. And so I think that's, to me, the starting point, is that sense of, honestly, I come to this work, though, I don't always wear it on my sleeve, from the perspective of Catholic social teaching, which says we're made in the image of God. And so to me, democracy is about being able to see that, let that image come forth. But we can leave that there and or
I would be really interested.
and get on to the technology.
Yes. Yes, let's get on to technology, but actually, let's go a little bit deeper. Because it seems to me that a lot of our models of human behavior are taken from the antecedents of our culture. We maybe go back to Greece and hold it up as some democratic idol, although you definitely don't do that in your book. But people do. And yet, I'm guessing you have almost certainly read Graeber and Wengrow's Dawn of Everything and are familiar with the premise in there. And if you want to tell me it's a false premise, we'll run with that. But for me, it made a lot of sense of, for hundreds of thousands of years, and still on parts of the world where indigenous tribal peoples live, we have the social technologies to do exactly what you said, to give everybody a voice and give them a sense of agency and being and becoming and belonging, which seems to be what humanity craves. And that it's what Francis Weller calls a trauma culture, that somehow the mimetic nature of humanity forked, and our bit of it became hierarchical and had a tendency to coalesce power in a very small unit at the top, and then to ignore the agency of all the people underneath. And it seems to me that what we're endeavoring to do, and I would like to know your view on this, is to head forwards into a space where we have the same agency that, say, the Wendat had in Graeber and Wengrow. They had cities. They had extraordinary capacity for intercommunication. They had highly advanced social technologies to make sure that nobody could grab power. And we can do this now in ways that our culture couldn't, because now we have the capacity. You're in Colorado, I'm in the west of England, and we're talking to each other in real time, and this has never been possible until the last few years. Is it that do you think, and this is more hypothetical, more philosophical, and possibly more spiritual, aiming towards a reconnection at the level that we probably once knew that we could say is our birthright? Or do you think we're trying to evolve something that has never been done before?
I think, again, we have to be careful about those idols. And I love the Dawn of Everything. I also had the privilege of knowing David Graeber when he was alive, and especially around Occupy Wall Street and after. But what I take from it is a sense of a deep belief in the creativity of people to devise and divide and invent social arrangements. I think it's really important to be careful about romanticizing, any kind of any set of social arrangements. And to me, the book is at its best when it really just emphasizes, look, there is just a lot more diversity than we've allowed ourselves to think. We've tended to have this very kind of teleological story about human history that everything looked like this during this time, and then with certain technological changes, everything changed toward this. And what the story that they try to tell is one in which, actually all along, there's been a lot of different kinds of things going on, and there's a lot to draw from and to learn from and to be in relationship with and to recognize ourselves as inheriting. And I think it's really important to be able to hold many different traditions at once. And one thing I try to do in this book, as well as in a project called Governance Archaeology that was really in part inspired by that book that I've been working on with the political scientist Federica Carugati and others. We've been exploring a wide range of governance legacies and mechanisms and practices. As we do, I think it's really important, first of all, to recognize, as you said, the things we can learn from legacies that have been silenced and undermined. But at the same time, to look more closely at some of the ones that we think we know. Federica's work is on her main research has actually been on the Greek cases, and she's trying to broaden her perspective, but also look more closely at those Greek stories and understand, wait a second, are we understanding these right? I think, for instance, I use the concept of feudalism in the book as a critique, as many people have, talking about the digital economy today. But I also think there's a lot to learn from not the cartoon feudalist image that we get about the European Middle Ages, but actually the real practices there, which were much more interesting and diverse than we give them credit for when we say, oh, those were the dark feudal ages. And I think we have to hold both. I think there's the language of democracy, of rights, of these things. These are bound up in, there's a lot to draw from and build on in even these colonial, often brutally violent regimes that we are trying to dispense with in certain respects. And I think this is what you're saying, but there's such a need for a reconnection and a resynthesis. And I come into this context of technology with an attempt to do that. I think there's a lot of folks who are critical of technology, and largely what they're coming is with a no. They have a democratic politics, and they see these kind of emerging technologies and they just want to say no. And I guess my perspective is that, I've always liked these things. Yeah, I find them fascinating. I find them, beautiful pieces of ingenuity, in the same way that when I was a kid, I found like fighter planes to be beautiful pieces of ingenuity.
Yeah, Spitfires
what
are
extraordinary
gorgeous. Yes.
engine. Yeah, I mean, exactly. How could we turn that energy towards something better? That inventiveness, that ability to create.
Yeah. Yes. And I share that with you. I find the capacity to talk to you in real time across the world is glorious, and it's going to expand the possibilities of what humanity is in ways that we are never going to understand until we're looking back at it. So let's go back to your book, because you present a really lovely and very rational, or at least very organized step through of where we're at in terms, and we don't need to go into the deep history of the internet because that would take too long, but the fact that the nature of governance in the outer world then gets reflected inwards. There was a phrase that I haven't got exactly because I can't find my notes, but along the lines of, when things are perceived as going wrong, the social issues are seen as engineering issues, and the people in Silicon Valley have got a lot of engineers, so that it's up to the engineers to fix it. And we don't really care how autocratic or top-down it is, as long as you can tick the box that says this problem has been fixed. And it's reducing everybody's agency on the way. So let's go right back to the beginning, because you have a lovely story, particularly of your mother being in a gardening club and of you being in various online things, and the contrast between the two. So for people who aren't familiar with that, let's set out the premise of Governable Spaces and then see where we get to. Over to you. You can do this with your eyes shut, I'm sure.
Well, the central problem is that I think we have allowed our online spaces to give us an impoverished set of democratic possibilities, an impoverished culture and tool set for self-governance. And this became especially clear to me, as you said, in a moment where I was struggling with someone, being a jerk on the internet in a big email list that I ran. And it happens, right? We've all seen it. And meanwhile, I was talking with my mother, who had just been elected president of her neighborhood garden. And I was just struck, as she was describing this experience and what she was doing, by how much better equipped her garden club was for solving problems with a set of bylaws and, means to actually hold her accountable that I had never seen in an online space. Why is it that this basic practice this garden club is not full of governance nerds. It is just an ordinary set of bylaws that, like every other garden club probably has too. Very familiar stuff. But there is this assumption for, centuries that, community associations are self-governing entities, and they have rules and they have mechanisms for doing that. And when we moved online, we kind of lost that. Yeah. So I tell a history of why I think that happened. going back to some of the earliest online spaces, hint it doesn't all have to do with big corporate power. The corporate power comes into the picture and takes advantage of this story. It has to do with just early norms and has to do with actually the network structure of the internet and the way it relies on servers and what a server is and how that connects to the legal system. But through it all, we ended up with this situation that I call implicit feudalism. It's implicit because we don't claim to be feudalists. We claim to be democratizing things, but we're actually practicing feudalism, where every online space you've ever been in probably has like an admin or a small group of admins, pretty much absolute power. I'm talking about the level of a Facebook group or a subreddit or a group chat. And the main ways of dealing with conflict are very crude. They're censorship and exile. And these are the things we rely on in the spaces that, that we increasingly spend large amounts of our lives in, and that are kind of supplanting the garden clubs of the world. And that might be okay, but there's a tradition of democratic thought. People like C.L.R. James, a great anti-colonial thinker, or Alexis de Tocqueville, more recently Adrienne Marie Brown, who insist that no, actually, like in order to practice democracy anywhere, it has to be in every. De Tocqueville pointed to those garden clubs as this is what makes like any other democracy possible. So if we're losing that could be a big problem.
Yes, and that was the thing that really struck me in the beginning of reading your book, was the understanding settling that had been a kind of felt sense before, but hadn't really landed for me, that the level of democracy that we experience begins to become the level that we anticipate as possible. And then we narrow our own ideas of what is possible. And so exactly as you said, even way back in Usenet times, and certainly now on Facebook or any of the others, even I'm on Mastodon. And if the guy who owns the server decides he doesn't like another server, he just switches it off and you then can't see anything from that server. And he doesn't have to give any reasons. It can be because they painted their cats pink and he doesn't like pink cats. And it's gone. And now you don't even know it exists anymore. And everybody, I'm sure, at some point has been kicked off Facebook for some infraction that you have no idea what you did. And they're not going to tell you. And you can try, person against machine to persuade them to let you back in again, but it's probably not going to work. So it's as if we're being conditioned at a genuine neurophysiological level to accept our own lack of agency. And yet, unless we're like you and you're exploring so many exciting and interesting things that I want you to tell us all about, we don't know even what's possible anymore. Because garden clubs in America, I have to say, sound amazingly well organized. I don't know anyone who exists in something that's got rules and structures like you're describing. And then the implication in our real world spaces is that we're presented with an election where we've got basically binary choices. And we all think that putting a cross in a box is somehow the height of democratic action and agency. And we're not up to speed with the possibilities. We were talking to Glenn Vile a week or so ago, who created quadratic voting. I don't think we did a very good job of describing what quadratic voting is. So we get to that. That would be really handy. But I think now what seems to me is that the capacity of technology to harvest people's ideas in real time is huge and is being used in places like Taiwan. And what worries me about that is you're harvesting what people think they believe. And how do we get them to understand that what GB News, Fox News, whatever the equivalent is in anybody's country, just told them isn't necessarily got any foundation in anything that anybody else would register as a fact? So that's a separate thing, is how do we know what we believe to be true? But how do we express it? How do we join together? How do we come together? So you have an entire chapter on homesteading on the superhighway. And I think it's worth, for most of us listening, I don't fully understand how the web as we surf it now is, how it was constructed, why it was constructed, what were the ideas in the beginning, and which ones were discarded as being not possible and which ones have come to the top. Is there a way that you can synthesize that relatively swiftly, tightly, tautly?
Well, the idea, the kinds of practices that I was describing earlier of these early online spaces run by a few admins, um, became, I think, the template for a broader kind of politics. And that's the story that enlarges this initial observation about like what's happening in our micro communities, and suggests maybe the consequences are actually expanding from there in some pretty important ways. And I think this has to do with like the archetypes we have in our minds about what a leader is, what politics is. And, you mentioned the ballot box. That's one kind of archetype of accountability of what democracy is. We have all kinds of images about, what we expect from governance. And I think those are formed in everyday life, and then they expand outward. And this idea of homesteading, this is a metaphor that has its roots in practices of the colonizing of the American West, right? Which the land was parceled up, land that was native land was parceled up into small plots that were essentially handed out to white men, largely white men, not entirely. But this began during the Civil War, and it was about promulgating the idea of kind of the free home landowning farmer as the basis of the American economy, and as the basis of colonization. And this same metaphor became very, very widespread in the early internet, with the language of homesteading and the frontier was used to describe some of these early spaces around the virtual frontier, and it continues to persist. I mean, like the second biggest blockchain, Ethereum, its early versions were codenamed Homestead and Frontier.
Yeah, I had no idea until
so
I
this
read
metaphor,
that.
this metaphor really persists, and what it imagines is this idea that we're going to, in a sense, like take hold of this space, but it starts to flow into larger scale politics when you see like the power of the admin, the sysadmin, the person who's running the server as the kind of landowner, the patriarch of the homestead, who rules over his family with a kind of iron fist and fences off the land from the natives and so forth, and the animals, and we start to see this image of the sysadmin converging with the image of democratic politics. So, for instance, what's the first thing that Donald Trump does when he leaves the presidency? He becomes the sysadmin of a social media platform. After 2016, when Mark Zuckerberg was, hot water for Facebook's role in the election that year, he starts touring the country and quoting Abraham Lincoln. People start wondering, is he running for president? There's this convergence happening between platform power and political power. Elon Musk is, essentially trying to make a political play by buying a social media platform. And so I think there's this danger that this logic of this very, very rigid top-down control that servers and systems enforce is becoming actually the image of our politics. And, we have figures like this a blogger, Curtis Yarvin, who kind of says the quiet part out loud and basically just is a, outright monarchist. Yeah. Who just says like, look, our tech companies are working great and they're very top down, and our whole online systems are very top down. Like, if we like that, let's just do it. Come on. What are we waiting for? Let's stop pretending we like democracy. And I think that's a really honest admission. And speaks to the power that these systems have in shaping our imaginations.
And in limiting the choices. I was very struck by your naming of our different forms of agency as affective and effective. And that the affective agency, I'd like you to expand on this in a second, but as I understood it, it arises it's an emotional outpouring, and it turns into, well, I suppose on Twitter where you just block somebody, but you scream at them a lot first. We're calling it Twitter. I don't mind dead naming Twitter. I'm not calling it X. Because you have no other perceived agency. All you can do, because we're in a world suddenly of zeros and ones, it feels like that's all you've got, is you talk to someone or you block them. You cut them out or you scream at them. Then it then shapes how we act in the real world. Can you talk about affective and effective? Because that seems to me, and what we need then is to be effective, but we need to understand that being affective is not effective.
Well, they both matter, right? I mean, in the same way that this is a distinction that is like further picking apart threads from the kind of earlier distinction between exit and voice, right? And every institution, in some respects, like needs to find that balance between exit and voice. Where can people leave if things aren't working for them, but also have the ability to have a have a say in shaping things and making. This comes from Albert Hirschman. The distinction between affect and effective is an attempt to push a little further on this, which is a recognition that in online spaces, we actually do feel like we have a lot of voice, right? The power of social media is like, oh, we have found our voice. There was a chant in Occupy Wall Street that I love very deeply. We, the people, have found our voice. And there's a respect to which, like, all social media is that feeling. Like, we can finally be heard now. Like, it's not just, Walter Cronkite who gets to tell us what the story is. But we have to distinguish between affective, which is the ability to express and share emotional experiences and to kind of disseminate our feelings and affect and an effective voice. Change the A to an E, which is the ability to actually hold people to account. Effective is like the ballot box, or being on a jury. The thing you say matters whether or not the person listening likes what you say, right? If a board votes to unseat a CEO, that CEO has no choice but to listen, right? And that's effective voice. And my mother's garden club's bylaws has effective voice in it, right? There are things that the president of the board has to listen to, and so and this is what I think is missing from our online spaces. We have that ability to complain loudly, and that feels good. But we don't have the balance of that with the ability to really hold people accountable. And as a result too, we end up with things like, what has come to be called like cancel culture or call out culture, and this is a product of precisely this problem, which is that we don't have due process. We don't have processes and practices for addressing conflict. Like you said, you get kicked out of a Facebook group or whatever, and you feel like you have no recourse other than just like complaining loudly somewhere else. And sometimes that works, but it's not the same. And similarly, when we have problems with people who have a lot of power, we don't have the ability to address the specific harm. So we have to kind of respond in excess. So actually, I think that a lot of the symptoms of our online lives come out of the fact that we don't have systems for doing things better. And often these are systems that we have figured out in other aspects of life, right? That's the crazy thing, is like, we're still catching up to the garden club, right? Like we could do this better. We know better. We're just not doing it in these spaces. And then we're wondering, why is everybody, being such a jerk? This was a kind of conclusion at the end of a wonderful book on trolling by a media scholar, Whitney Phillips, where she realized, wait a second, maybe what all this trolling is about is it's not the trolls' fault so much as like, actually, we just have a society that doesn't do well listening to people, like doesn't give them, other avenues for having their voices heard and for feeling accountability.
Right. So many ways we could go. Let's stay a little bit with the whole concept of Silicon Valley now being one of the most powerful places in the world. It doesn't really matter what nation it's a part of, because the output of Silicon Valley touches everywhere except probably North Korea and maybe the People's Republic of China. And it struck me, I worked for 3 years in a computer games company for my sins. It was lovely, and I really, really enjoyed the people there, but they were to a man. I was the only non-male person there, white, very techy. They spoke like they coded in very linear formats, which was quite interesting coming in as a relatively non-linear person. And their view of the world was very, very rich in a very, very, very narrow band. And I am projecting a bit, but it seems to me they weren't that dissimilar. They just had English accents and non-American accents to the people who have made Facebook, Apple, Google, and all the rest. And that their assumption was, first of all, we are all really nice people. We are all very kind to each other. And therefore, the ways that we do things are nice and kind. And therefore, are universally lovely. And we don't like the idea of anybody. We don't like rules. They're essentially innately libertarian in rule structures are a bad thing. We should all be able to work out the rules for ourselves and then apply them for ourselves because we are nice, decent people. Which is great until it stops being great. Or until you're not one of the straight white men in the middle. And so I was reading Plurality by Audrey Tang and Glenn Vile, and they were saying they'd done studies of Silicon Valley, and they are essentially mostly male, mostly Caucasian or Asian, mostly center-right politics, atheist, libertarian. And that then is the structure they create for themselves, because that's where they're comfortable. And then reading your book, it seems to me there's a lot of people on the edges of not being white and not being male and not necessarily being atheist and certainly not necessarily being libertarian, who are exploring really interesting ways of doing things differently. Can we now begin to explore some of those? So the question is, I think what I've heard you say, and certainly what I think I've read, is that the structures of Silicon Valley arise out of the people there. And it's not that they're all sitting down trying to create techno-feudalism. It seems to me, listening to people like Justin Harris, they're as horrified by the result as anybody else. But it's gained its own superorganism momentum and they don't know how to stop it. But there are people on the edges going, hey guys, we have some ideas. And that's what the last few chapters of your book are about, looking at the ideas. So is my assessment what you're saying broadly? And then can we begin to explore the ideas? Particularly, I can't remember its full designation, but something around the 1st of May that you're doing, which sounded extremely exciting. So let's head in that general direction.
Yeah, a really guiding idea for me that, may be familiar with some listeners is this idea of the tyranny of structurelessness, which comes from Joe Freeman, who was writing about, feminist and other activist groups in the late 60s and early 70s. And this is an idea that many people have recognized in the context of the internet. Once I wrote to her and said, can I interview you about how this idea has played out online? And she said, I'm sick of people asking me about the internet. I don't know anything about the internet. But it turns out this idea is very, speaks to us, which is this idea that when you don't have a structure of rules, the existing dominant power structures tend to reproduce themselves even more perniciously in a space that pretends that everything's cool, and will, we can be decent to each other, right? And this is just a pattern that so many of us recognize in our online lives, as well as in activist circles and things like that. And she insists on the need for kind of democratic structuring, she calls it. And a more contemporary example of this that someone who I've learned a lot from is Coralyn Emke. She's a software developer. She's transgender. She didn't feel safe in some of the spaces that she was in as a developer, like conferences around the language that she worked on, around the web framework. And for years fought to introduce codes of conduct, just basic sets of rules that say, like, you can't do things that are really harmful to people, right? And these communities, like, they didn't want rules. They
Right.
didn't want any of this. And finally she won, and people just recognized, oh, actually, this is better, right? Now we have a framework for solving like not simple, but like really important problems that come up. And I think this is a very powerful example. Her code of conduct, the contributor covenant, has spread like wildfire across open source communities. And there's this widespread recognition now that, like, yes, a code of conduct is just, you should have your software license and your code of conduct set up from the very beginning,
Right.
and
Right.
that's
And
just
can you give us a
basic.
flavour of what's in the
Um,
code of conduct? I'm guessing it's the kind of thing that we're sort of used to on Facebook codes of conduct. You know, be nice to people, don't bully people, don't scream at them for things that are not their fault, that kind of thing.
y- I mean, basic like respect and professional behavior, and like don't uh, 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 use people's identity as a a- as
As a
a
weapon.
vector of
Yeah.
abuse, and things like this. I mean, it's really basic stuff, but having it there, and having everybody know from the beginning, like, there are rules here, makes a really big difference, because it means then you can actually do something when a harm
And
occurs,
what are the
right?
sanctions? Because I'm thinking now of Eleanor Ostrom talking about commons, and that for her, one of the rules of a
Mhm.
functioning commons was that there was a clear set of rules and a clear set of sanctions, but usually there was okay, you didn't really mean to step over the line here. Let's us explain there's a line here and let's talk about it before you get to the, okay, you're off. Is that the kind of way that it works?
Yeah, so it has a set of a kind of process for addressing the harm. Now, one thing that Coralyn and I have engaged a lot on is the sense that the code of conduct itself doesn't um, address who has the power to do this enforcement. It kind of it will inherit whatever governance system sits on top of it. So she and I have also gotten to collaborate some on exploring that question, on a project, for instance, called Community Rule, which is a tool my lab's been building to help groups write simple bylaws. And so you need to put these pieces together. I think of it as a kind of, I talk in the book about this concept of governable stacks. What are the components that are social and technical that we need to put together to actually make this stuff possible? You were talking about being on a Mastodon server. It's a Twitter, open source Twitter-ish social network. For years, I've co-founded a cooperative Mastodon server. As you said, Mastodon itself doesn't guarantee democratic practice. You have to cobble the pieces together to make that happen. You need to intentionally build in the bylaws, build in, decision-making processes, know how you're going to hold people accountable, all these things. And the idea of governable stacks is this invitation to make those deliberate choices, to say, okay, we're going to bring together technologies that we can actually control, right? That's important. But also introduce the systems by which we will govern those technologies and our relationships with them and our relationships with each other, just to recognize, like, every time we've had somewhat democratic experiments in online contexts, like Wikipedia, I think is an important example. Maybe less known, but very important, is Debian, which is it's an operating system that runs a lot of the internet. It's run as a constitutional democracy, and it had to be built very intentionally.
Right.
And so this is a call, to do that intentional work. You mentioned this server co-op called May 1st that I use for my cloud systems and my email and things like that, websites, all this, and it's cooperatively governed between the U.S. and Mexico. We're bilingual and binational, and it's a community that has really bent over backwards to make sure all of our technology is stuff that we can control. It's open source, it's self-hosted, we can control it, and we have the governance structures to decide how we control those things. So this is a small scale model, but these are the kinds of things that we need to, really build out at larger scales in order to, have be able to practice democracy in our networks.
Yes. And scalability seems, reading your book, to be a thing that is still, it's something that we're aspiring towards, but we haven't quite got there yet. And I'm wondering if there's a critical mass in the way there's a Dunbar number, whether there's a kind of technological critical mass. Because I'm also remembering a line, and I think it was Adrienne Marie Brown, it may not have been, who said that reinventing the wheel is a feature, not a bug, of what we're doing, that we have to keep going back to baselines and working out that, are we still being basically democratic? Are we still giving people agency? Are we still giving them that sense of being and belonging and becoming? Or are we just sleepwalking our way into a different kind of technocracy? Because this is where I get to listening to you, reading Audrey and Glenn, reading your books, that within our culture, and I'm not trying to romanticize Indigenous cultures, but I think they do have a different mindset. I'm also reading a book called Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, and who's Brazilian, half Indigenous, half German. So there's a lot of internal contradictions that she talks about. And her Indigenous grandfather says that the core wounding of the colonizers was not them taking the land and killing the people. They were epiphenomena. They were bad, obviously, and they were traumatic, but the core trauma was of the belief that we are separable. Not even that we're separate, but separation can happen. And that the Indigenous peoples don't have that belief. And it's a really different, then we get to the philosophical, spiritual core of, is it the tendency of those of us in the Western educated, industrial, rich, democratic trauma culture, whatever we want to call it, us, the colonizers, is it our tendency to move towards holding power, wanting to take power, wanting to sleepwalk into technocracies? And if that's the case, at what point do we look at the fact that we can create as many governance structures as we like? And I'd still like to look at what they actually are and how they work. But I also want to look at, is there a kind of an upstream place we need to go to where we change our value set rather than expecting our social technologies to change it for us? Does that make sense as a question? It may be an unanswerable question, but I'd love to share it with you because you seem to be the kind of person who exists at this liminal space.
I think it's a really deep one, and it's, I think, a challenge that every community, every society in history has had to figure out. What do we structure and what do we leave open, and where is the complexity and where is the simplicity? It reminds me of the experience of being at the first Radical Exchange conference years ago in Detroit that Glenn organized. I had the privilege of being on the first panel of that conference, and that was after I'd written a somewhat critical review of Glenn's book, which was, I think, a great credit to him that he wanted his critics close. And I have a lot of appreciation for all he's done and for what that space represented. But one thing that it hit me with was there was a kind of longing among many people there to kind of solve governance with an algorithm, to say, okay, maybe quadratic voting will just solve governance, right? Like this will make governance fixed. And it just hit me as I was hearing that. I just thought of all the experiences of governance I'd had in my life and all the relational dynamics and all the messy complexity that it always represents, and just felt like this is the wrong direction. And I think this move that Glenn has made more recently toward the concept of plurality is a beautiful correction. It's a recognition that what we need is not like the one simple algorithm for everything. What we need is a world that is really comfortable with complexity and that embraces multiple systems that allow for multiple forms of input and things that we can't even name as systems, and just allows this kind of, the Zapatista vision of a world in which many worlds fit. And I think that embrace of the plural is a really important step for, our colonized minds, and at the same time, and colonizer minds and so forth. And at the same time, within that complexity, quadratic voting is a really interesting mechanism. I was playing with something similar while trying to devise, a grading system for a class I have to teach in the fall. It's a neat tool to know to have around, but I wouldn't pretend that it's the only tool.
Yeah.
And I also made sure to be really conscious of the way in which, like, I'm doing this in the context of a class, and we're going to make sure there are really clear human, fleshy, intuition based guardrails around this mechanism, because we cannot allow it to be a kind of sufficient game.
Right. Oh, that itself, that sounds like a podcast all on its own. How do we do that? Exactly that. How do you get the human factor in to what is essentially going to be an algorithm, one way or another, which is not a human thing? Goodness, I want to know how you do that. That sounds really interesting, because you quoted Plato or Aristotle, I can't remember which, saying that basically friendship is the bottom line. Democracy is a kind of, superfluous thing. If you've got enough friendships, you don't need the rules of democracy. You can comment on that when I get to it. So what I'd like to do is take a step back, and you were talking about stacks, and I think it's worth defining what a stack is for people, but then also looking at what are the governance structures that work. So in your experience with the 1st of May, with all the other various ways of doing this, what is emerging for you as things that are standing the test both of time and of scalability?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I take a lot of inspiration from the legacy of cooperative economies, which I've spent a lot of time working in and studying. My last book was on cooperatives. It's called Everything for Everyone. And, one thing I learned from studying that history is that cooperatives show that different kinds of scale are possible. And this is actually, the kind of scale that a lot of institutions use, governmental institutions. It's scale built around subsidiarity. For instance, there are two big hardware stores in my town. One is the national chain Home Depot. It's like every other Home Depot. The employees are paid badly, and they mostly don't know a whole lot about the things in the store, because there are just so many things, and it's cheap, and it has its purpose. There's another one that's locally owned. It's called McGuckin. Everyone in town adores this place. It is just like such a community institution. It's actually a member of a cooperative, so it buys hammers with a lot of other hardware stores around the country, and so gets economies of scale through purchasing. But the business itself is local, and it feels local the minute you walk in.
Right.
And the people work there for a long time. They know the store inside and out. It's just a totally different feeling. And that to me is a kind of model for how we could do scale differently with technology. There are lots of ways in which seems like no brainer. Open source technology allows us to, share things much more widely, do this tech development collectively, but deploy it locally. The problem is a lot of our financing mechanisms are not built. So venture capital, the major driver of innovation in Silicon Valley and ecosystems like it, they're really built on building monopolies, and gaining monopoly power over a certain market or close to it. And this is powerful. It drives, interesting projects and innovation, and it's comfortable with risk, which is nice, but it drives technologies toward this kind of capture. And I think we need to, in order to build spaces that can be really governed at human scales. You mentioned the Dunbar number, that allow us to make our technologies like fit for purpose and fit for our communities. We need to find ways to invest in locally governed technologies. We've relied far too much on the assumption that these technologies need to be run centrally,
Right.
and they really don't. They really don't. We need to recognize that we can do scale differently. The question is not to scale or not to scale, which is often how it's posed, but what kind of scale do we want? What's the texture of that scale? Is it top-down scale? Is it bottom-up scale? Is it, how does it delegate power and authority? How does power and authority rise up? And I think there are lots of really powerful models we could turn to. When we talk about conflict resolution, this idea of having a one-size-fits-all rule set for the entire world, like Meta has, is insane. Nobody would do that. When we start a new town, we create also presumably something like a school board and a court system and a local, law enforcement system and all kinds of local entities, with the assumption that it's best to solve problems in a way that is attuned to the local culture, or else it's just not going to work. So again, I think a lot of, the answer here is just apply stuff that we do in other contexts to our online spaces. And it's our online spaces that are just truly weird in comparison to how we normally operate our lives and our societies.
But then they are becoming the way we normally operate our lives and our societies. I'm watching the way that Twitter, now X, has radically changed the nature of politics in this country. We've got an entire party called Reform, which is it's actually a private company owned by the guy it doesn't matter. Let's not go into the details because my head will explode too badly. But I don't think it would exist if Twitter wasn't there. If Twitter and possibly GB News, they've set it up to be an equivalent of Fox. We could go down the rabbit hole, actually, of how we gain the information. Because it seems to me there's two separate things in democracy. There's gathering what people wish and what our deepest desires are and making them compatible with each other and finding ways to give everybody a chance and not having the tyranny of the majority, but also not having the tyranny of the minority. And then there's how does the majority and the minority get their information and sense making within that, which I imagine is a whole separate module in what you teach, because it seems you can gather people's where I'm at in as much nuance as you like. And if where they're at is what they just saw on a screen and it's garbage, then garbage in, garbage out, you're going to end up with something that could be as toxic as if you just, let the guys who are putting out the garbage define things, which is where we're at the moment. Let's park that for a moment, because I think that's a separate conversation. I would like to have it, but I'm not sure it's relevant now. I'm still really curious, and going into the 1st of May and the other online spaces you're in, how do you choose the governance of this? How is it top down, bottom up? Who sets what the rules are? How do they decide what the rules are? How do they decide who arbitrates? How do they decide how does governance happen within this particular set space?
I think it really depends, and it should depend. And another kind of scale we have to think about here is, how do you co-govern lots of things at once? If we were to, if everyone were just to follow the directions in this book immediately, and we would find ourselves with a new problem on our hands, which is, how do we govern all these things? And that would force us to, I think, make some really interesting choices, and to recognize that not everything we enter into should be governed in the same way. I'm a member of a credit union, and I don't really want to participate in the governance of that credit union. I don't, my mind turns to mush when it sees a spreadsheet. And I just want to be able to trust that the people who are in control are accountable to people like me, and to others. In contrast, I'm really interested in experimental social media. So, something like social.coop, this Mastodon server, I really enjoy participating in the governance of that. And I have a lot to offer because this is what I study all day and what I think about. And so I'm glad that it's set up well for very participatory governance. For other people, maybe they don't want to think about social media all day. They just want to use it. Right. So maybe we should have, a collectively governed version that they can trust, and they have good reasons to be able to trust, but they don't actually have to be involved all the time. So I've been involved in a research project on this idea of attention economies in governance services. And this has really emerged in the context of blockchains, which, many folks may associate largely with financial scams and frauds and things like that. there's also a side of it, the side that I've been really focused on, where there's actually a lot of governance experimentation. And the reason is just because this is a technology that has to be governed. Like the whole point of it is that it's not controlled by one server. So how is it controlled? And it's really the first time that millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of energy and resources have gone into designing governance technologies for online native spaces. And it's very exciting in that respect. And one thing that these communities have become obsessed with is how to design governance around attention, and how to work around the assumption that not everybody who participates in a community or holds a token is going to have the context and ability to participate. So they've devised tools like liquid democracy, where you delegate your votes to somebody else. Different kinds of staking mechanisms where you're assigning value to one around a decision in much more sometimes in ways that are not just an up-down vote, but allow you to really have more fine-grained voice through a vote. It's become a space where people have had to kind of ask that question of, if we were to reinvent governance from the beginning again, how would we do it? And how would we do it in a network where, for instance, we can't assume we know everybody's identity? And in some respects, this has become a really important laboratory for imagining what these systems could look like. And to me, they don't provide the final answer in any respect, but they do show that there is so much creativity that's possible when we allow ourselves to ask that question. What for a given project, what is the appropriate kind of accountability for it? And the answer is going to differ from project to project. And, I've been involved in another line of work called Exit to Community, where we've been working with startups to try to mature toward community ownership and governance. And again, it's not one story that we end up landing on. We've built a kind of case study library of many different approaches that people are taking to that question. And that, just like the Graeber book that we started with, that the Graeber and Wengo, the Dawn of Everything, it's that multiplicity that to me is thrilling. Is that recognition that democracy is not one thing. It's many, many things that, and many kinds of possibilities. It's a toolkit. It's a space of problem solving and imagination, rather than just a fixed form that was invented hundreds of years ago that now we have to defend at all costs for some reason, even though it's not working.
Yes. And you said quite early in your book that democracy tends to be defined by the people who have the power, and it's whatever is maintaining them in power is what they say is democracy, which is manifestly what's happening around the world at the moment. We're running out of time. I'm aware you've got other places to be. I so would love to explore Exit to Community in more depth. That sounds so exciting. So much that you're doing. I just want to move to Colorado and just spend my life doing your classes, but I doubt it'll happen. In closing, so I will point people at your books and at your projects. Just as a final thought for people for whom a lot of this is new ideas, I want to ask two things. One is good places to explore, but I would say reading your books are really good places to explore. If I were a person who was beginning to explore the concepts of what democracy might be, do you have any? I heard you just say it's different things to different people. It depends on the context. It needs to be quite liquid. I love the idea of liquid democracy in its defined sense, and it has no edges, and it flows, and the moon will change it, and all of those things. Are there core principles that you think still apply?
I think the heart of it is asking that question of how does accountability? And I think it's really essential for us all to ask that in any community we're in. One question I often ask, I talk with a lot of people building democratic communities and designing them, especially cooperative. businesses and the like. And one of the first questions I often ask is, who do you want to be lying awake worrying? You know, how do you, when a hard question comes up and inevitably you have to make hard choices that are going to hurt somebody or hurt some interest. How do you want your priorities to be aligned? And I think any community can ask, right? I'm somebody who's prone to lying awake at night, so it's kind of personal. And so and often I realize, oh, I'm lying awake worrying about the wrong thing. So I think a good way to begin is ask, how could you make sure you're lying awake worrying about the right things? And how can you, at the beginning or at a crucial, early stage, make sure to set even just some basic frameworks to hold everybody accountable in a community. And that's why, for instance, this tool, Community Rule, has been fun to work on for me. Is it's just an attempt to create a tool that enables people to more easily just throw together some quick bylaws on the assumption that you'll throw them out later. But at least there's something in place that tells you, here's what I have to do in order to throw them out. And just build on the assumption that, accountability is good and you want to clarify, and you don't want to spend all your life on it. I've seen many times, like for instance, people who are just too focused on these rules, they spend all their time making the rules and they don't actually build anything that's useful for people in the world. Right. So this is just the backstop, but it's an essential step. And if you want to go deeper into this work, an organization I'm part of, I now chair the board. It's called MetaGov, and we're an open community involved in research and experimentation, including experimentation on ourselves in online governance. And we have an open Slack, and it's a space that you can really go deep into these questions. Come to our seminars. We have some of the most extraordinary people working on these questions, whether it's reforming how governments work or working with big tech companies or building small experiments. All of this is taking place.
And all of this is taking place. That is such an encouraging thing to hear, is that in the heart of the beast, the Moloch even, possibly, that is out there that we think moves as a superorganism and cannot be stopped. There are people in the heart of it working out how to hold people accountable, and who do they want to be lying awake thinking about at night. Nathan, this has been absolutely inspiring. I am so grateful that you were able to make the time. Thank you so much. I will point everyone at everything that you're doing. Is there anything else that you wanted to say, or have we got to the end of where we can get today?
Only just that I'm grateful for the chance to join you, and thank you for your questions and your interest in this.
Thank you.